What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and we're back with another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to break down the main slate for tonight for FanDuel, which we got a 5 game slate tonight. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So, first off, some key guys you want to keep a lookout for as far as injuries are LeBron and Jaren Jackson. They're both questionable, but I actually expect both of them to play. And then there's some key guys who are out tonight. You got Ja, he's out for the season. Cade is out. Franz Wagner's out. Jakob Pertl is out. So some key guys out tonight. So, anyways, let's go ahead and take a look at the top value plays for tonight. And the number one value play, that's going to be Bismarck Biombo. He's only 4,400 and he's been getting the start recently, playing pretty big minutes 27, 31, and 26 minutes. Um, he's only $4,400 and there's no Ja. So, pretty much everyone on Memphis is getting a little bit of boost with no Ja Morant. And he's actually going against the Mavs, who allow the seventh most fantasy points to opposing centers. So big value there with Bismack Biyombo. He should be pretty heavily owned. And if Jaren Jackson does end up missing the game, expect his ownership and his projection to shoot up even more. Then you got Julius Randle. He's $9,100 and he's on a nice little stretch. He's averaging 48.64 over his last five. And that's what we got him around that projected for tonight against Portland, who allow the seventh most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. So pretty good value there with Julius Randle, who's been playing pretty well since they traded RJ Barrett. And then you got LeBron, who, like I mentioned earlier, is questionable, but I do expect him to play. He's $10,000 and he's going up against the Raptors. He's averaging 51.41 over his last 10 games. So he's on a nice little stretch. And he's going against this Raptors team who they haven't been very good defensively since making the OG trade for RJ Barrett. They actually have been allowing 122.8 points per game defensively since making that trade. So a pretty good value there with LeBron if he does play, which I do expect him to play. Now, as far as my sleeper pick, that's going to be Josh Hart for the Knicks. Now he's $5,400, so he's not exactly cheap. We have him projected to be 4.8% owned, and projected him to score 24.43. So not a whole lot of value there, but he does have the potential to pop off. Every now and then he has these big rebound games. Look at this last game on January 5th. He had 15 rebounds, finished with 40 fantasy points. So he has pretty big boom potential. He scored 37 plus in 3 games this season. So if he does score in that range again tonight, I mean, he could end up being in the number one lineup at $5,400. And he's going against his former team, the Blazers. So he's a nice little sleeper pick. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the first game of the night. You got the Timberwolves at Orlando. Now, Minnesota actually allows the fewest points per game, and they play at the 10th slowest pace in the NBA. And then Orlando, they allow the 11th fewest points, and they're pretty average as far as pace of play. So don't be surprised if this is a very low scoring game. But with that being said, as far as Minnesota is concerned, you got to consider Anthony Edwards in at least a few lineups, considering how he's been trending lately. He's averaging 52 over his last 10 games and he's still under $10,000. And if you take a look at his last game, 64 and a half points. So you have to pick up Anthony Edwards anytime he's under $10,000. Now, as far as Karl Anthony Towns, I'm not crazy about him. He's averaging just 34 points over his last 10 games. So he hasn't been doing very well recently. And he constantly gets into foul trouble. Look at how many times he's gotten 5 fouls, 4 times in the last 10 games. So I'm not crazy about Karl Anthony Towns. And the same applies to Rudy Gobert. I mean, he's only $100 cheaper, and he's not much better. Mike Conley at $5,800, maybe you pick him up in one or two lineups in case he gives you, 35 plus, which he's capable of, although he has been trending down recently, averaging just 23 over his last five. So I'm not going to go crazy with Mike Conley, but you could consider him in a few lineups if you want, just in case he gives you that 35 plus again. Jaden McDaniels, he's playing pretty big minutes. Take a look at his minute log. And he hasn't really been that productive with these high minutes, but at $4,900, you may want to consider him in a few lineups just in case he finally has the production that matches his minutes. And that's pretty much it. I mean, everyone else I think is too expensive. Nas Reed, $5,700. I mean, even if Karl Anthony Towns gets into foul trouble, I think that's still too expensive for Nas Reed. And then everyone else is too expensive on Minnesota. Let's go ahead and take a look at Orlando now. And let's go ahead and sort this by projection. Now, Banchero's been going off lately. He's averaging 59.8 over his last five. And actually, since the Franz Wagner injury, he's averaging 62.9 in those last three games. So at $9,700, you're going to have to pick him up in a few just in case he continues this trend. Jalen Suggs is another guy that's been doing well since the Franz Wagner injury, 45, 36, and then 29, but he actually fouled out that game. He was in foul trouble that game. So I like Jalen Suggs in a few lineups. Cole Anthony, not crazy about him at $6,200. I think that's too expensive. Same goes to Batadze. Mo Wagner, that's too expensive. He's not even starting. And then you got Chuma Okiki, $4,300. And he's been playing pretty big minutes over the last three games, and he should be getting the start. He's been starting recently. So I do like his value there. He is going to be pretty heavily owned. We got him projected to be 18.41% owned. So maybe you want to consider fading him because I wouldn't be surprised if the optimizer ends up picking him up at that price point with him getting the start. And then that's pretty much it for them. Everyone else is too expensive. And that takes us to the next game. You got the Kings at Detroit. Both are pretty bad teams defensively. The Kings allow the eighth most points, and Detroit allows the fifth most points. And the Kings play at the 11th fastest pace, while Detroit plays at the sixth fastest pace. So don't be surprised if this is a pretty high scoring game. Now, for the Kings, Domantas Sabonis at $10,100, he's going to be pretty highly owned. We have him projected to score 51.68, and we have him projected for 46.2% ownership. So he might be a good fade candidate, even though I do expect him to have a pretty good game against this bad defense. And he's been doing pretty well recently. He's averaging 57 over his last five games, which is why he's projected so high. I also like De'Aaron Fox at $9,600. We have him projected for 47 fantasy points, 26.69% ownership. So he's going to end up in a lot of optimizers, and I'm definitely not opposed to that. Malik Monk, $6,600. I think that is kind of expensive for him, but you take a look at his last game, or actually, I'm sorry, three games ago against Orlando, he dropped 63 points. Granted, that was an overtime game, but still, he does have that potential. So maybe you pick him up in one or two lineups, but I'm not exactly crazy about that price for someone like him. Same goes to Keegan Murray, Harrison Barnes, and Kevin Herter. They're in the 4,000s, but I don't think they have that high of a ceiling. So I'm not going to pick up any of those guys. So let's go ahead and look at Detroit. So for Detroit, you got Jalen Duren, who's on a nice little stretch, averaging 35 over his last 10 games. So $7,400, that's a decent price for him. I'm not crazy about him because I don't think he has that high of a ceiling, but he might be worth picking up in a few lineups. Bojan Bogdanovic, $6,800, that's a decent price for him. He's averaging 32 over his last five. And actually, Sacramento allows the third most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. So maybe you do have to consider Bojan in a few lineups. But Jaden Ivey, I think 6,400 is too expensive. Same with Killian Hayes. Alec Burks, 6,000 is way too expensive. And then you're not really going to get much production from everyone else on Detroit. So that takes us to the next game. You got Portland at the Knicks. So Portland, they play at a pretty average pace, and they got a pretty average defense. The Knicks, they allow the second fewest points per game, and they play at the fourth slowest pace. So as far as Portland is concerned, you got Anthony Simons, $8,100. I think that's kind of expensive, but you still have to consider him in a few lineups, even against this Knicks defense, because he could easily give you 50 plus, which he's done three times in the last 10 games. So you have to consider some Anthony Simons. Jeremy Grant, I think $7,600 is too expensive for him. Scoot Henderson, $6,700 is too expensive. Now, Reith is someone you might want to consider in even though he's $6,700, maybe you put him in one lineup or two just in case he goes off again because he scored 40 plus two times in the last four games. So he's boom or bust. Maybe you pick him up and maybe he goes for 40 again, but I'm not going crazy with him at $6,700. That's kind of expensive. And then everyone else on the Blazers is way too expensive, especially going against this Knicks defense. Now let's take a look at the Knicks. Now, for the Knicks, I talked about Julius Randle earlier, him being the top value play. We have him projected to be 42.9% owned, which actually might make him a good candidate for someone that you fade if he ends up in all of your optimized lineups. You know, you got someone like Scotty Barnes, who's not much more expensive, or someone like Siakam, who could easily outscore Julius Randle tonight. So maybe you fade him for one of those guys. But I do like his value. Jalen Brunson, $9,000. That's pretty good value for him. We have him projected to be 40% owned. and he's been playing pretty well since the trade, averaging 46 over his last 5 games. Isaiah Hartenstein, maybe you want to pick him up, but $7,800 is really expensive for him. Um, Even though he's been playing pretty well lately. I mean, maybe you pick him up in one just in case he gives you 50 again, which he's done twice in the last 3 games. But I'm not going crazy with him at that price point. OG Anunoby hasn't been playing that well since the trade. $6,200 is kind of expensive for him, but maybe you consider him in one or two lineups just in case he finally gives the Knicks a good game. DiVincenzo, $5,300. I think that's too expensive. Uh, Josh Hart, I talked about earlier as being my sleeper pick, just because every now and then he has these big rebound games and gives you, 35 plus. And if he does that at $5,400, he could break the slate. So he's my sleeper play. But then everyone else is too expensive for the Knicks. And that takes us to the next game. You got the Grizzlies at Dallas. And for the Grizzlies, they play at a pretty average pace and they have an average defense. While Dallas, they allow the 10th most points per games and they play at the 10th fastest pace. Now, the big news, as I mentioned earlier, is Ja Morant is out for the season. So that means that Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson are back on the table. Although Jaren Jackson is questionable, I do expect him to play. Now, Desmond Bane, I like his value with no Ja Morant. However, 33.18% projected ownership. He's going to be pretty heavily owned. So that does make him a good candidate to be faded because if he gives you under 40, then he's not gonna get it done for you. Like I mentioned earlier, Jaren Jackson's back on the table. He's been balling lately, even with John Morant. He's averaging 43 over his last 5 games, including back-to-back 50-plus point games. So I do like Jaren Jackson if he does play. Marcus Smart, $7,000. That's pretty expensive for him, but you still might want to consider picking him up without John Morant. He kind of becomes the point guard for them. Look at the last game without John Morant. He scored 53.2. So maybe you do pick up Marcus Smart, even though he's pretty expensive. Bismack Biyombo, great value there, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe you consider fading him just in case he gives you under 20, which he's capable of doing. Now, Vince Williams, $5,200. That's pretty expensive, but maybe you do consider him in case he gives you another big game like he did last game without John Morant, but I'm not going crazy with him. Luke Kennard, $4,300. That's pretty good value. So maybe you consider picking him up, but I really don't think Luke has that high of a ceiling. But maybe you pick him up and maybe he just ends up in a bunch of optimized lineups because he's kind of at that filler price. Zaire Williams is only $4,500. Maybe you consider him, especially if Jaren Jackson ends up missing the game. Same goes to Xavier Tillman if Jaren Jackson ends up missing the game. Otherwise, I don't think Xavier Tillman is worth picking up. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look now at Dallas. So for Dallas, you got Luka and you got Kyrie. Both of those guys are worth picking up, but only pick up one or the other. Don't pick up both of them. Kyrie's been balling out lately. He scored 50 plus in his last 3 games, including last game he dropped 67. And then for Luka, I mean, he's averaging 66 over his last 10 games. So you definitely got to consider picking up Luka in some of your lineups. Tim Hardaway Jr. hasn't been doing much since Kyrie's come back, and I don't like him at $5,900. However, I do like Derrick Jones Jr. at $5,400. He's been playing pretty well recently, and he scored 30 plus in 4 out of the last 10 games. So you might want to consider some Derrick Jones Jr. in some of your lineups. Dwight Powell, I think $5,000 is way too expensive for him. Josh Green, too expensive. So none of these other guys are really worth picking up. But that takes us to the last game of the night. You got the Raptors at the Lakers. So for the Raptors, they have an average defense and they play at a pretty average pace. Although their defense has been really bad since trading OG for RJ Barrett. Like I said earlier, they're allowing 122.6 points per game since that trade. Now the Lakers, they have an average defense and they play at the ninth fastest pace. So for the Raptors, Scotty Barnes hasn't been playing that well since the trade. He's averaging just 36.92 over his last 5 games. So $9,200, that his price is a little bit lower now. So maybe you do consider picking him up, and maybe you consider fading someone like Julius Randle, who's only $100 cheaper for someone like Scotty Barnes, who could easily outscore Julius Randle. And the same applies to Siakam. Maybe you fade Julius Randle for Siakam, who is $900 cheaper than Julius Randle. He could easily outscore Julius Randle. Emmanuel Quickly, $7,300. They've raised his price because he's been balling out since the trade. He scored 30 plus in every game since joining the Raptors. So maybe you do want to pick him up just in case he drops 40 again, which he did against Memphis. But I'm not picking him up. I think that's a little bit too expensive for him, and I don't really see his ceiling. RJ Barrett, maybe you pick him up in one or two lines because he finally had that big game. He scored 56.2. So maybe you think, okay, maybe he's starting to find his way in this offense. But I'm not going to go crazy with RJ Barrett. And then Schroeder has been doing much since the trade. You got Chris Boucher, who's going to be pretty heavily owned because he's probably going to get the start for Jakob Pertl. $4,800 is pretty cheap for him. And he's actually had pretty good back-to-back games, and that was even with Jakob Pertl, and that was in low minutes. So I do like Chris Boucher. Although if you are going to fade Chris Boucher, what you want to do is you want to fade him for Jonte Porter, who's only $3,700. Because if Chris Boucher has a bad game, that's going to mean a lot more minutes for Jonte Porter. So you might want to consider that fade in a few lineups. Gary Trent, 4,900. I really don't see his ceiling. And yeah, no one else is really worth it on the Raptors. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the Lakers. And like I mentioned earlier, you got LeBron who's questionable, but I do expect him to play. Now, for Anthony Davis, you have to consider him in a few lineups. He's averaging 62.6 over his last 5 games, and he's had two 80-plus point games in his last 5 games. So you have to consider some Anthony Davis, especially if for some reason LeBron ends up missing this game, which I don't think he will. But if he does, obviously you have to consider Anthony Davis. Also, if LeBron misses the game, you got to consider someone like D'Angelo Russell at $6,300. Otherwise, there's no way D'Angelo Russell is worth it. Austin Reeves, I think $7,500 is too expensive for him. Torian Prince, too expensive. Christian Wood, only worth consideration if LeBron James ends up missing the game. Otherwise, he's not going to really give you much. And then everyone else is too expensive. No one else is really worth it. And that's pretty much it for all of the games. Now, before I go, I'm going to go ahead and run one lineup just to see what we're working with for tonight. So you got Killian Hayes, Marcus Smart, Jaden Ivey, Luke Kennard, Desmond Bain, LeBron James, Chuma Okeke, Julius Randle, and then Bismack Biyombo. So you got a lot of Grizzlies with no Ja Morant. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know what you guys think. If you're not already a member, make sure you subscribe to DraftTime.com. You can sign up for a free 7-day trial. And good luck to everyone tonight.